A democratic socialist who calls Trump a fascist walks into the Oval Office and walks out having a love fest with him. After months of calling each other communist, fascist, despot, and threatening raids and funding cuts, the big Oval Office cage match everyone expected just never happened. Instead, Trump sits there smiling, defending Mamdani, saying they agree on a lot more than I would have thought, and that he'll be cheering for him as mayor of New York. Mamdani smiles back, calls the meeting productive, and keeps repeating one word. Watching that, the only honest question is, what game are these two people playing on the rest of us? And why does it quietly blow up the stories both parties have been selling to you about politics in America? Game theory has an answer, and it starts with this. They weren't really talking to each other in that room. They were talking to their own audiences. So first we need to define who these players are really. Mamdani is not some mushy centrist who wandered into the wrong building. He's a democratic socialist who's backed by the DSA, who campaigned on rent control, public housing, free buses, free childcare, and much higher taxes for millionaires. He has openly called Trump a fascist and a despot, accusing him of attacking democracy and immigrants. Trump, for his part, spent the race warning that Mamdani's victory would destroy New York, calling him a 100% communist lunatic and threatening to choke off federal funds and send in federal agents if he won. Those were the trailers that the media showed us. Mortal enemies, existential stakes. And then the episode comes out and everyone's confused because the two enemies are suddenly behaving like old chums. In game theory terms, the first thing to understand is this. They are playing something called as an audience cost game. And in an audience cost game, your real stakeholder isn't the person across the table, is the crowd watching you, ready to punish you if you look weak or disloyal. That's why this love fest is a problem for both parties. Republicans lose their perfect socialist villain. Democrats also lose their clean, no common ground with fascism story. So, what does each crowd want? Trump's crowd wants two things at the same time. They want him to crush the radical left, but they also want him to fix crime and the cost of living in New York, a city that still is seen as a symbolic capital of the country, whether many admit it or not. Mamdani's crowd also wants two things at the same time. They want him to stand up to what they genuinely believe is a fascist president, but they also want him to bring home federal money, tackle what Mamdani calls as a national crisis of affordability, and do something about rent and grocery prices in a city where millions are struggling. If they had done the big screaming match in the Oval Office, the hardcore activists on either side would have absolutely cheered, no doubt about that, for about 12 hours on social media. But it would have made them both look unserious to regular voters and poisoned any future negotiation over crime, utilities, or housing. So instead, what did they do? They showed their audiences that we can fight later. Right now, we are being the adults in the room talking about your bills. So that is game number one, minimizing the audience cost of cooperation by acting like statesmen for one afternoon. Game number two, signaling and cheap talk. Listen to Trump's language in that room. The same guy who called Mamdani a communist nutjob suddenly says, "We have more in common and common ground than I initially expected." Calls him Mr. Mayor, praises how easily he beat his opponents, and says he'll feel very good if Mamdani succeeds. In game theory, that's cheap talk. Words that don't force you to do anything right now but send a signal about how you want people to see you and what they think you might do later. Trump is sending a very targeted signal. He's talking to big city voters who feel crushed by prices and who've been told that Trump is their sworn enemy and that democratic socialists are their only hope. His message to them is, even your socialist mayor can work with me on affordability, and that I'm not this cartoon villain you were promised. I'm the guy who can really get things done. This costs him nothing in the moment. He doesn't sign a bill, he doesn't give up a policy, he just changes his tone long enough to scramble the narrative. That's cheap talk with a purpose. Game number 3, preference falsification and strategic friendliness. Here's something that media barely knows how to explain. A couple of days after the Love Fest, Mamdani goes on Meet the Press and gets the obvious question: do you still think Trump is a fascist? He doesn't dodge or soften the blow. He says yes. That's something I've said in the past. I say it today. So inside the Oval Office, you get the smiles, compliments, jokes. Outside, the ideology snaps right back into place. That is preference falsification. You behave in the moment as if you're closer to your opponent than you actually are because the situation makes it profitable to do that. Mamdani's message to his base is pretty obvious. I did not sell out. I think this man is still a threat to democracy, but I will walk into his office, look him in the eye, and get what I can for 8.5 million New Yorkers. Morally pure rhetoric, ruthlessly pragmatic in behavior. That's a proven strategy in hostile environments. Game 4, agenda setting around affordability. This one had to catch your attention. Read through the coverage of the meeting and you see the same word over and over again: affordability. Reporters try to drag them back into the fascist and the communist labels, into immigration, into the usual culture war flashpoints. Mamdani keeps pivoting to the cost of housing, transit, energy, and food, literally citing the percentage of New Yorkers who cannot afford a $2.90 bus fare. Trump keeps talking about helping New York and how they share priorities on housing and prices. This is frame control. If they can make the game about cost of living instead of ideology, both men win. Trump gets to run as a national affordability president who can even work with socialists when it comes to your wallet. Mamdani gets to run as the mayor who can look at a fascist in the eye and still walk out with commitments on important things like utilities or housing. And herein lies the problem. Their parties and activists hate this. In game theory terms, that's a principal agent problem right here. In this game, the principals are the parties and the activist bases. The agents are Trump and Mamdani. Republican strategists want Mamdani to be the perfect radical left villain for 2026. The communist mayor who proves Democrats have gone insane. Trump just went on camera, called him reasonable, congratulated him, talked to him about common ground, and promised to help him succeed as a mayor. That detonates months of talking points. On the left, activists wanted a televised confrontation with the fascist. They wanted Mamdani to walk into the Oval Office and set him on fire, rhetorically. No smiles, no compliments, just pure moral denunciation. Instead, they got a polite press conference, mutual praise, and joint statements about affordability. In other words, both agents quietly defected from the script. Their side wrote for them painstakingly because their real game is power, resources, and narrative control. Not really giving Twitter exactly what it wants. Game 5, the repeated game and reputation. Both guys know that this isn't a one-off photo op. Trump and Mamdani are now locked in a repeated game over federal money, over policing, over immigration enforcement, over whatever disaster hits New York next. In a repeated game, blowing up round 1 in front of cameras might impress the purists in your base, but it destroys leverage for all future rounds. A cordial round 1, on the contrary, a fake truce, buys you options. You can always escalate later if the other side betrays you. You cannot, on the contrary, easily walk back from a televised screaming match. Reputation-wise, both men are investing in brands they need going forward. Need. Trump gets to look like the bigger man. I'll work with anyone, even if a socialist, if it helps Americans afford life again. Mamdani gets to look tough but pragmatic. I'll sit down, even if he's a fascist, and I'm not going to act too pure and not fight for my city. Again, the ideology didn't change, the payoffs did in this case. So, no, Trump and Mamdani did not suddenly become best friends. They are still opponents with completely different visions for the country and for New York. What changed for one afternoon were the payoffs. Game theory says that when payoffs change, the behavior changes. The insults, which is fascist, communist, despot, are still there before and after that meeting. The interests just momentarily lined up around one thing: the politics of your wallet. The lesson is simple here. The next time you see a love fest between supposed mortal enemies, don't ask, have they finally come together? Ask, what game are they playing and which part of that audience is the pawn this time? And at least for now, for both Trump and Mamdani, there are two words that fit this Oval Office performance: well played.